Did Islam give women their rights? Introduction. When you hear the words women in Islam, what images come to mind? Oppression? Silence? Subjugation? For many educated viewers, these are the default associations. But here's a question that might surprise you. In the 7th century, when European women couldn't inherit property and were themselves considered property, Islam was granting women the right to own businesses, to divorce, to inherit, even to attend university lectures. This isn't a defense of everything done in the name of Islam today. It's an invitation to separate the faith itself from cultural practices. To understand what Islam brought for women, we first need to understand what existed before. And here's where it gets fascinating and uncomfortable. In pre-Islamic Arabia, the status of women was, by most accounts, brutal. Female infants were routinely buried alive, a practice the Quran explicitly condemned and outlawed. Women were treated as property. They could not inherit, they could not own property. They had no legal personhood. As one scholarly analysis puts it, women in pre-Islamic Arabia experienced discrimination in social, economic, and political spheres, and were often reduced to objects and commodities. Now, it's true that some women in prestigious tribes enjoyed relative freedom. Some were merchants, some even poets. But this was the exception. For most, women's lives were defined by male control. Then, in 610 CE, something remarkable happened. The Prophet Muhammad began receiving revelations that systematically dismantled this system. The Quran outlawed female infanticide. It gave women inheritance rights. It made their consent a requirement for marriage. It elevated the status of mothers to the point where the Prophet said, "Paradise lies under the feet of mothers." The transformation was so profound that honest scholars now call it a paradigmatic turning point in women's history. Now, to put this in perspective, let's compare this to what was happening elsewhere. In 7th century Arabia, Muslim women were going to mosques, engaging in business, and seeking knowledge. In 19th century England, women couldn't own property, and the University of Cambridge didn't even allow women to sit for exams until 1886. Islam gave women an education mandate, literally as a religious duty, over 1,400 years ago. In many parts of the Western world, comparable rights didn't arrive until the last century. In fact, I would argue that all the rights women have gained are due to the West's influence by what they adopted from Islam. So, if Islam was so progressive, why does the modern perception look so different? We'll come back to that. Core teachings. Let's get specific. What rights did Islam actually grant women? And let's be honest, the answer is more nuanced than either critics or apologists often admit. First, spiritual equality. The Quran is remarkably explicit on this point. Over and over, it addresses men and women together as equally accountable to God. Here's one verse. Stay with me. Surely men who submit themselves to God and women who submit themselves to Him, and believing men and believing women, and obedient men and obedient women, Allah has prepared for all of them forgiveness and a great reward. In the sight of God, the Quran says, a woman's soul is just as valuable as a man's. Period. Second, education. The Prophet declared, and this is unequivocal, it is the duty of every Muslim man and every Muslim woman to acquire knowledge. And this wasn't just rhetoric. The Prophet's own wife, Aisha, became one of the most important scholars in Islamic history. People traveled from across the Muslim world to learn from her. Third, economic rights. Here, Islam was genuinely revolutionary. Women have the right to own property, to earn money, and to keep that money entirely for themselves. When a woman marries, she receives a dowry that is her exclusive property, not her father's, not her husband's. She can work and spend her income freely, with zero obligation to contribute to household expenses. And inheritance. Yes, a daughter receives half of what a son receives in many cases. But let's contextualize. Before Islam, women inherited nothing. Half of something is infinitely more than zero, and the female share is calculated based on her responsibilities in the family structure, which are financial, unlike the male's obligation to support the entire household. You have to know that all other civilization did not give the woman any right to inheritance. Fourth, marriage rights. No woman can be forced into marriage under Islamic law. The Prophet made this explicit. A woman's consent is required, and women have the right to initiate divorce if the marriage is unbearable.
Prophet Muhammad said, "He who marries a woman without her consent, his marriage is void." As one source puts it, women in Islam are considered legal persons with the right to enter contracts, own property, and initiate legal proceedings, rights that many Western women didn't have until the 19th or even 20th century. We'll explore this more when we tackle misconceptions. Comparative analysis. Let's put this in perspective, and I invite any historians watching to fact-check me on this. The rights Islam granted women in the 7th century were by any measure ahead of their time. But ahead of what, exactly? Let's look at what was happening elsewhere. In the Byzantine Empire, a married woman's property legally belonged to her husband. Divorce was heavily restricted. In the Christian world, a doctrine developed that, paraphrasing St. Paul, women should be silent in the churches. Now, compare this to Islam. In the early centuries, Muslim women like Aisha, Khadija, and Nusayba were prominent in public life. They taught jurisprudence, engaged in commerce, even fought alongside the Prophet in battle. Khadija, the Prophet's first wife, was one of the wealthiest merchants in Mecca. She ran her own business, employed the Prophet himself, and proposed marriage to him. This wasn't some marginal exception. It was an accepted part of early Muslim society. One scholar notes that Islamic law in the medieval period gave women legal rights that were much more extensive than those of their Christian counterparts, both Greek and Latin. In early modern Turkey, Egypt, and Andalusia, Muslim women could own property and initiate divorce in ways that Christian women simply couldn't. Let me give you a concrete timeline. 622 CE, Islam establishes women's right to inherit and own property. 1882 CE, Married Women's Property Act in England allows wives to own property. 1920 CE, women in the US gain the right to vote. 1948 CE, Cambridge University finally confers degrees on women. In England, women couldn't own property until 1882. In the United States, women's suffrage was 1920. Cambridge University wouldn't give women full academic degrees until 1948. Islam granted economic independence and educational rights 14 centuries earlier. I'm saying that in its historical context and in terms of its scriptural principles, Islam represented a massive advancement in women's rights. So, what went wrong? That's the question. Addressing misconceptions. Here's the heart of it. If Islam is so progressive on women's rights, why are so many Muslim women around the world living under restrictions? This is where we need to be honest and nuanced. Misconception number 1. Islam treats women as inferior. The Quran is explicit about spiritual equality, but there are verses, like 434, about men being protectors of women, that have been interpreted to support male dominance. All the philosophies and theories brought forth by the West in particular are not fixed, but change day by day, until they have reached our current state, which is not good for humanity in most cases, but rather entails great misery, especially for women. Despite the common perception that they have gained many of their rights, they have become commodities and objects of whim, and at the very least are not protected as Islam protected them and intended for them. Misconception number 2. The hijab is oppression. Now, hijab, the headscarf, is seen by many as a symbol of female oppression. But from an Islamic perspective, it's about modesty for both men and women. Men are also commanded to lower their gaze and dress modestly. The Quran says, tell the believing men to lower their gaze, and tell the believing women to lower their gaze and guard their modesty. For many Muslim women, hijab isn't oppression, it's liberation. It says, I am not defined by my body. I am defined by my mind, my character, and my faith. Misconception number 3. All Muslim women are oppressed. This is perhaps the most harmful stereotype. It reduces 1 billion women across dozens of countries to a single narrative. And it ignores the extraordinary diversity of women's experiences in the Muslim world. The West wants to measure things only by Western concepts, which have already become questionable. In Indonesia, Malaysia, Turkey, and many other Muslim-majority countries, women are presidents, judges, scholars, and CEOs. Muslim women run businesses, lead prayers, and engage in activism. And they're doing this in the name of their faith. The Prophet's teachings have challenged the existing society to build a society on new concepts, far from the traditional unfair situations. So here's the honest takeaway. Islam's texts are remarkably progressive. To understand Islam's present reality is often a painful contradiction of its own ideals. That is for several reasons. Call to reflection and invitation. Here's what I'd like you to take away from this conversation. First, if you've only heard one side of the story, that Islam oppresses women, you've heard an incomplete story. The historical and scriptural evidence paints a far more complex and more inspiring picture. Second, we need to separate the faith from the culture. If you see women in some Muslim countries suffering, don't blame Islam. Blame authoritarianism, cultural patriarchy, economic deprivation, and sometimes, frankly, the cynical use of religion to consolidate power. Third, and I think this is profound, Islam holds that every human soul, male or female, has equal worth before God. That's not a modern invention. It's right there in the foundational text. In Quran, to whoever, male or female, does good deeds and has faith, we shall give a good life. So here's my invitation to you, and I mean this genuinely. Don't take my word for it. Don't take the stereotypes. Go read the sources yourself. Open the Quran. Read the life of the Prophet Muhammad. Listen to Muslim women, especially Muslim women scholars and activists. They're out there, and their voices matter. And if you're someone searching for spiritual truth, I want to say this gently and respectfully. Islam offers a vision of human dignity, gender justice, and spiritual equality that is both ancient and remarkably relevant today. Millions of highly educated, thoughtful people, men and women, have found in Islam a faith that elevates women rather than diminishes them. If you're curious, I encourage you to learn more. Talk to a Muslim scholar. Read a translation of the Quran. Visit a mosque. Form your own educated opinion. Because the best thing you can do with a complicated issue like this isn't to accept easy answers from either side. It's to engage critically, compassionately, and intelligently. If you want to understand Islam's teachings on women, ask Muslim women themselves. Thank you for watching. This conversation matters, and I'd love to hear what you think. So please, leave a comment below. Quick recap. Islam in the 7th century gave women rights, education, property, inheritance, consent in marriage that were unprecedented and, in many cases, ahead of the West by centuries. The gap between Islam's ideals and modern practice comes from cultural and political factors, not from the faith's core teachings.